The Bush administration has promoted the misguided and destructive war in Iraq by targeting 5 core concerns that often govern our lives. Concerns about vulnerability, injustice, distrust, superiority, and helplessness. Looking ahead, the continued occupation of Iraq, or an attack on Iran, will likely be sold to us in much the same way. Forewarned is forearmed. What follows is a brief guide to help us recognize, counter, and resist the appeals of warmongers. First, their vulnerability appeals. They claim our actions are necessary to protect the American people from dire threats. Here's President Bush, 6 months before the invasion of Iraq.
Knowing these realities, America must not ignore the threat gathering against us. Facing clear evidence of peril, we cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun that could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
And Vice President Cheney, also pre-invasion.
There is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction. There is no doubt that he is amassing them to use against our friends, against our allies, and against us.
And policies promoted by others will instead make everyone less safe. The President 2 weeks before the invasion.
The risk of hoping that Saddam Hussein changes his mind and becomes a gentle soul. The risk that somehow that inaction will make the world safer is a risk I'm not willing to take for the American people.
But the Bush administration's vulnerability appeals are deeply flawed, and they must be countered. In fact, it is the unjustified use of military force that makes us less safe. It multiplies our enemies. It drains valuable resources, and it unnecessarily places our soldiers in harm's way. Second, their injustice appeals. They claim our actions are a necessary response to the wrongdoing of others. President Bush on enemy combatants.
With our actions, we will send a clear message to those who kill Americans. We will find you and we will bring you to justice.
And the Vice President, 5 years after 9/11.
The passing of more than 5 years has not managed to dim the outrage of September 11th, 2001. And as our nation wages the war on terror, we'll never lack for inspiration when we think of the innocent men, women, and children who were the first to fall in this war.
And criticism of our actions is unjust, and our critics are therefore also wrongdoers. Defense Secretary Rumsfeld on media criticism.
The worst about America and our military seems to so quickly be taken as truth by the press and reported and spread around the world, often with little context and little scrutiny, let alone correction or accountability after the fact.
But these injustice appeals from the White House are also deeply flawed, and they too must be countered. In fact, misguided military aggression is itself a profound injustice. It targets those who are not to blame for our suffering, and in so doing, it destroys countless innocent lives. Third, their distrust appeals. They claim our actions are necessitated by the dishonesty of our enemies. Here's President Bush on Saddam's regime.
We know the methods of this regime. They buy time with hollow promises. They move incriminating evidence to stay ahead of inspectors. They concede just enough to escape punishment, and then violate every pledge when the attention of the world is turned away.
And Rumsfeld on the enemy's strategy.
They're trained to lie. They're trained to allege that they've been tortured. They're trained to put out misinformation, and they're very good at it.
And those opposed to our actions cannot be trusted. They are disloyal or misguided. Vice President Cheney on critics of the administration.
What I will again say is dishonest and reprehensible is the suggestion by some U.S. senators that the President of the United States or any member of his administration purposely misled the American people on pre-war intelligence.
But again, the Bush administration's distrust appeals are deeply flawed and must be countered. In fact, the reckless use of military force is a poor way to deal with our suspicions. It eliminates the opportunity for peaceful diplomacy, and it makes other countries more distrustful of us. Fourth, their superiority appeals. They claim our actions are based on our high moral principles. President Bush describing our mission in Iraq.
These young Americans understand that our cause in Iraq is noble and necessary, and that the advance of freedom is the calling of our time.
Cheney on American courage and ideals.
Armed with that courage, confident in the ideals that gave life to America itself, we go forward to serve and to guard the greatest nation on earth.
And this contrasts sharply with the immorality of those who oppose us. The President on how we're different.
It's unacceptable to think that there's any kind of comparison between the behavior of the United States of America and the action of Islamic extremists who kill innocent women and children to achieve an objective.
But these White House superiority appeals are yet again deeply flawed, and they too must be countered. In fact, the destruction caused by so-called preventive war undermines our nation's core values, damages our reputation around the world, and reduces our influence beyond our borders. And finally, their helplessness appeals. They claim we persevere and succeed when faced with obstacles. President Bush, only 6 weeks after the invasion.
My fellow Americans, major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed.
And the President 3 years later.
I believe we will prevail. I understand how hard it is to prevail. But I also want the American people to understand that if we were to fail, and one way to assure failure is just to quit, is not to adjust and say it's just not worth it. If we were to fail, that failed policy will come to hurt generations of Americans in the future.
And if setbacks do occur, they could not have been avoided, and we are therefore blameless. Rumsfeld on going to war.
You go to war with the army you have, and not the army you might want or wish to have at a later time.
But just like all of the others, the Bush administration's helplessness appeals are deeply flawed and must be countered. In fact, false claims of success and cries of victory at all cost are not evidence of toughness under fire. Instead, they reflect a refusal to face reality and a lack of courage to admit and correct mistakes. Many other examples of these appeals could be offered, and the culprits are certainly not limited to Bush, Cheney, and Rumsfeld alone. But the message should be clear. Our core concerns are easy, soft targets for warmongers. Knowing this, the rest is up to us. We must thoughtfully and critically examine every claim that military action is the best or only answer to the foreign policy challenges we face, today and in the future, and it is our responsibility to encourage others to do the same.